Welcome to Inspiring Perspectives, a podcast by Think Parallax featuring fresh takes and bold ideas for the real-world sustainability challenges and solutions at some of the world's most respected brands and companies. I'm your host, Derek Sabori, and this is what sustainability sounds like today. And all right, well, here we are. Maisie Ganzler, welcome to Inspiring Perspectives. I'm so glad you're here on the show.
Thank you. I am happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you. You are the author of a new sustainability leadership book, which is called You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime, and Other Lessons from the Food Industry for Creating a More Sustainable Company. Congratulations on your book launch.
Thank you. It's very exciting.
Is this your first book, or have you written books before?
This is my first, so it's a completely new experience to me. And having worked for one company for 30 years, Bon Appétit Management Company, it's a very different experience to be marketing a product and myself.
Yeah, I bet it is. So yes, you are also the former Chief Strategy and Brand Officer at Bon Appétit Management Company. And like you said, you were there for 30 years, two different stints. And you were, I said former, but it's only recently that you're the former Chief Strategy and Brand Officer, right? Up until January, you were there, and then retirement came. Is that right?
That's right. I retired at the beginning of February, so I'm just a couple months in, and so far I recommend retirement. It's great.
I bet. Well, congratulations on that. Are you off in retirement land somewhere? Where are you dialing in from?
I'm actually calling in from my home in Santa Cruz, which is not a bad place to be, but I did do some traveling right after my full-time work wrapped up. I went to Mexico and Costa Rica, did some surfing, did some hiking, and now I'm doing a lot of time promoting the book, and that's great too.
So now you're on your book tour, and hopefully you can take your surfboard with you wherever you go, right? Hopefully you've strategically aligned where your book events will be.
Well, it's great that so many of them are virtual, so I can be wherever I want to be.
That's right, like this one. Well, we're going to get to the book and our topic today, but I do want to talk about your role while you were there at Bon Appétit. Bon Appétit Management Company is a nearly $2 billion on-site restaurant company offering full food service management to corporations, universities, museums, and special venues, right? It's based up in Palo Alto, California, 1,000 different cafes, 33 states, dozens of marquee clients. You were all serving more than 250 million meals a year. That's a lot of food. You held a lot of different variety of roles. But tell me a little bit about just what that job entailed and what that was like. What kept you there for so long?
Yeah. Well, I used to say that with great power, like 250 million meals a year, with great power comes great responsibility. And then I realized that I was quoting Spider-Man's uncle when I said that.
Hey, I wasn't going to bring it up. I was not going to bring it up.
And I'm not even a superhero fan, but somehow, through osmosis, I heard that phrase and reused it. But I think it's actually true that when the purchasing power of a company that size, you have a great responsibility, but also a great opportunity. And that's part of what kept me there for 30 years, really the length of my career, is the ability to really bring my values to work, to be able to make a positive change, feels good. And I also loved the problem solving aspect of it. I think that you work with a lot of ESG professionals. There's probably a lot listening to this. And you know that these are puzzles, that we're often doing things first. And leadership requires tenacity, but also an ability to fit together disparate pieces in a way that I thought was fun.
So it sounds like it was that challenge was what really kept you motivated and kept you going. Our conversation today, we're really leaning in on sustainability. And one thing, as you and I were speaking, and obviously looking back at your titles, none of your titles had sustainability in them, yet you've written a book on sustainability. I know that was intentional. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So very intentionally, nobody at the Bon Appétit corporate office has sustainability in their title. And that was really important to me because I think once you create a sustainability department, sustainability becomes their job. And I believe if you're really going to have sustainability at the heart of your brand, that you need everyone to be working on sustainability. It's embedded into everybody's KPIs or key performance indicators. It's embedded into evaluation of every department. And it's not just one person's siloed responsibility.
I love that. And I think it's really important. What's funny, with some of my colleagues at Think Parallax, one of the things that we've talked about on that topic is how, who stays up on the latest, trends, the expectations, policy, regulations, certifications in the food industry, et cetera. Do you just kind of spread that out across everybody, or was there somebody was there a committee who kept up on all of that?
Well, it was a group of people, and I think that's reflected in what's happened as I've transitioned into a strategic advisory role out of the full-time work. We promoted 3 people to VP level. Our director of communications became VP of communications, a VP of purchasing, and a VP of wellness and food education. And so it's that triumvirate's job to keep up on the science, on the purchasing initiatives, on market trends, all of that. It's everyone together.
Got it. Somehow, though, you ended up in a position to write a book on corporate sustainability. So obviously there was enough there, all of that time there, and all the things that you worked on. I know you've got a great TEDx talk, I think a couple of them, but talking about building out supply chains, the challenges that come along with sustainable food sourcing, building out sustainability in your culture. What along those lines, I guess, how did you get to that point where you felt confident enough to write that book? It's a weird way of saying it, because I'm just all the experience you had led up to that. But what were some of the, I guess, tipping points or exciting things that you worked on while you were there that really said, hey, this is a story I need to tell?
Well, I wouldn't want anybody to misinterpret that because we didn't have anybody with sustainability in our title, that meant it wasn't a priority for the company. In fact, it was quite the opposite, that sustainability was something we thought about every single day. And because of that, I had a lot of stories and wins and maybe more instructionally losses in the sustainability arena that I wanted to share. And it was actually a friend of mine who said, we should write a book. And I thought, write a book? What am I going to write a book about? And she put together a table of contents. And anybody who's in the communications field knows it's much easier to edit than it is to start with a blank sheet of paper. So when she took that step of writing a table of contents, I looked at it and I said, no one wants to read that book. Here's the book they want to read. And then I was able to picture in my head what I thought would have been helpful to me on my journey and to the people that I come in contact with at conferences or work alongside in different buyers groups, things like that. And so I really tried to write a book for anybody who wants to put sustainability at the heart of their brand and create a differentiation through it. I talk about it from a food perspective because that's where I came from, but the lessons would be transferable to any industry.
Speaking of industry, how do you, from what you've seen over the years, how has sustainability evolved in the food industry while you were there? Since you've written the book, I know we often look to the food industry as, I guess, one of the pioneers in sort of getting sustainability out to the shelves and to the customers and telling that story. How has it evolved from your perspective?
Well, I think it's really come from a place where we didn't even have literally the word sustainability. When we first started doing some of these actions, we put them under the umbrella of corporate social responsibility, of CSR. And when we went to talk about these things publicly for the first time, so to give you a kind of a timeline, we started our real concerted efforts and buying strategy in 1999 with our commitment to local purchasing. But we didn't start speaking about these things publicly until 2004. And in 2004, when we did go out to our own people first, we did a national roadshow to all of our chefs and managers and talked to them about the importance, again, of at that point, CSR. The feedback was really interesting. People were excited about the concepts. I heard things like, this is how I cook for my family at home, and it's great to be able to do that for our guests. But again and again, we heard, but customers won't care. Like, I care, but customers won't care. That was 2004. And fast forward, the food service management industry works with RFPs. We get requests for proposals to do bids for business. Every single RFP we get today has a significant sustainability component. So that's in a 20-year period from even people who were personally committed to the idea, thinking there's no business benefit to that, to it becoming required from a business perspective.
Right. We've come a long way then, right? And that leads us to today's topic, this idea of making meaningful change. That perhaps is, that's the main part that we always talk about it. But I think you've got this interesting perspective on getting credit for it. So not only making the change, but really getting out there, telling your story and getting credit for it. Tell me about that. Why is that important to you? What does that mean to you?
When I pitched the book, I pitched it as Omnivore's Dilemma meets How I Built This. If people are podcast fans and have listened to I guess people listening to this are podcast fans.
That's right.
To Guy Raz's How I Built This, where you really hear the story of a founder and the ups and downs towards what now seems to often be overnight success, right? Very rarely is. And so I wanted to be able to do the same thing to really show, yes, this is how we made things better in the supply chain, but here's the business thinking behind it. Because fundamentally, we're a for-profit business, right? We're not an advocacy group. And so we need to make money while we're doing this. And often, sustainability initiatives are seen as being costs. And I wanted to show that maybe they are costs, but they're also revenue drivers if you do it correctly.
So would you say getting credit for it? I mean, I guess there's two ways, a few different ways to look at it. You're getting credit for, in the eyes of the consumer and your customers, right? They're giving you credit for doing the right thing. You're getting credit from those, I guess from let's say the finance department, your CFO, your operations team. It's more efficient. Everybody hopefully is giving you credit for that work that you're doing because they all start to see the business benefits of it. Is that fair to say? I mean, it's a holistic approach, right?
Absolutely. Something that reminds me of is in 2007, we started our low carbon diet, looking at the connection between food choices and climate change. And when you do that, you very quickly get to reducing meat on the plate, specifically beef, but meat in general. So in 2007, we started trying to reduce meat because of the environmental benefits. Well, in 2008, we hit an economic depression, right?
Yeah.
And our finance team said at that time that we would not have fared so well if we had not already been working on reducing the most expensive thing on the plate, the beef. So that was a nice dovetailing of sustainability and financial performance.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote or perspective on that, because often I know during that time, there were also companies who were making progress. That happens. Everybody's budget needs to get cut. And often sustainability teams that were already small were like, oh, I have no more resources. We're not able to make these gains. But perhaps because maybe they weren't tackling the right thing in the right parts of the business where there was true value across the board.
Well, let's start with the fact that it was the sustainability team that got cut. Well, what if sustainability was everybody's job, right? See
Touché.
Above.
Yes, yeah, no, that's great. I love it. What does it take? I guess I think I read and that I think it's in the book that you said there's not simply one switch that will make a company more sustainable. There are dozens of them, and they need flipping every day. Is that what you found? Is that the case? That's a true statement, I would imagine, that you believe in?
I do very much so. I think advocates and customers often think that there's this mythical switch somewhere that if a company would just pay more, they could flip the switch and be sustainable. And it turns out that it's not that easy. Yes, money helps, but if you want to really make change, the path is not as clear as just do this, not that. Talking about reducing meat consumption. Well, that's a complicated thing to do. At Bon Appétit, that involved first convincing the chefs who are making the menuing decisions every day that they should have less meat on the plate. Then you talk about how do you create dishes that are enticing and create satiety and that woo people over to wanting to eat less meat. It can't simply be about reducing meat and saying, screw the customer on what they want, right? So these things are complicated. And I think the more that you're transparent about that and that you open up the inner workings of your company and explain to your customers and to your employees why these things are hard, you'll get actually more credit for them in the long run.
And I do need to rewind for a minute because I think there was a food industry word in there that I'm not familiar with. Satiety? Is that what you said?
Satiety.
What is that?
Thank you for pointing that. Feeling satiated or full. So often when people talk about eating a vegetarian meal or something that's plant forward with less meat, they say, well, I'm going to be hungry, right? I don't feel full. So how do you create that feeling of fullness without meat?
Yeah, and I find that fascinating because I've been on a mostly plant-based diet for 30-something years, almost exclusively. And I can tell you, I get full. I eat a lot. I mean, I think we just eat more. You just eat more. But yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like it's maybe a learned thing, like an acquired thing. Once your body sort of settles in, then that becomes the new norm, and you can definitely feel satiated. I think that's my perspective on it for sure.
I'll also throw a little tip in since, we're talking food now.
Yeah.
Fat creates satiety. So often when we go to a plant-based diet, we also go to a default very low-fat diet, just eating vegetables. But throw some olive oil on there, throw some, if you're eating cheese, something like that, some peanut butter, you'll feel satiated.
All right. Good tip. Good tip to all the those in the transitioning into a plant-based diet, right?
Yeah.
You interviewed a lot of brand and sustainability VIPs in your book, whether it was what you learned from speaking with them or what you learned from Bon Appetit. What were some of the biggest takeaways, I think, from your time there or from these people that you interviewed? These are probably colleagues and just people in your circle.
Well, one of the greatest pleasures of writing a book was that it gave me an excuse to call up people that I had admired and say, "Can I talk to you for a couple hours and ask you all the questions?"
This is why I have a podcast.
Yeah. Well, it's fun, right?
Yes, absolutely.
You get permission in a different way than you would in a social setting. And one of my takeaways was how calm people were about some of the things that would seem controversial. And maybe that's part of the entrepreneurial spirit that is a risk taker. But a couple examples that come to mind, I asked Rob Michalak, who had been the director of social issues at Ben & Jerry's for years. I asked him about the campaign called Milk with Dignity that was waged against Ben & Jerry's. And he talked about how there was first an initial misunderstanding about what the campaign was asking Ben & Jerry's to do. And so it took longer than maybe the Milk with Dignity people had wanted. And they were publicly talking about this and criticizing Ben & Jerry's. And I said, well, didn't that hurt your feelings? And because you were in it, you were trying to do it. And he said, no, that's what they're supposed to do. And we're an activist company, so we have to support activists. And he was very calm about it. Didn't take it personally. I talked to Gary Hirschberg, the founder of Stonyfield Organic, and he took stands on all sorts of issues, including gun control. And he put messages about the issues they took stands on their lids because they didn't have a big advertising budget. So they had their own lids that they could mark up. And he got kicked out of the House of Representatives cafe. He got the yogurt kicked out, and they said, these are too political for the House of Representatives.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, he laughed at the irony of, but he was also rather calm about the idea that his product had been taken off the shelves somewhere. And in both cases, really knowing that they were doing the right thing and soldiering on anyway in the face of criticism.
Those are great stories. I know there are a lot of challenges as well that you've probably faced. You talk about them on the TED stage, but probably from the interviews as well. Did you hear of challenges? Did you experience challenges? Talk about the hard stuff, the uphill battles.
Yeah. The greatest challenges that I ran into was trying to get suppliers to make change. It's one thing to change your own practices, but when you want to buy meat raised in a different way, you have to get suppliers who raise meat in a different way, as an example. And sometimes you're aligned well and you've got a common vision, and sometimes you don't. And in some cases, suppliers even lied to us about their practices, which was a surprise.
Yeah.
Or massaged language a lot to try to change the meaning of what we thought they were doing. So that was really a challenge, and we had to change suppliers. And if you work for a large company, changing a supplier is a monumental task, but I think really shows the commitment that we at Bon Appetit had, that we didn't just throw our hands up when a supplier said something was hard. And I would say that that was a common thread throughout the interviews I had, of really sticking to things when things were hard or not clear. Walter Robb, who was the co-CEO of Whole Foods for a couple decades, talked about the debate that the executive team had over the Whole Foods market stance on GMOs, on genetically modified organisms. And I would have thought that that would be an easy decision for Whole Foods. But they debated, how do you stand in the way of progress from a technology standpoint? Could this be used for good? What's the difference between giving people information and making the decision for them from a customer's perspective? Was GMOs even an important issue, since they're already not allowed in organics and Whole Foods had such a commitment to organics? And so really, this intense debate I found to be very interesting. But again and again, in my experience at Bon Appetit and the people that I talked to, it was not shying away from the tough stuff, but really sitting in it and fighting through it creates leadership.
And that's a through line, I think. I know from my experience in this space, working with our clients, talking to leaders. I mean, it's just complicated. It's not easy work, right? I think you said that at the beginning. It can feel like, oh, you just flip a switch and you just make a decision. But everything also has trade-offs. And right when you think something might be the better thing to do, you find out that, oh, well, that also has impacts. And that also affects other things that are connected. That's why, I mean, we use this term that everything is connected. It's all interconnected and tied together, right? What did you find that was effective for moving those suppliers along with you? What was effective in building those partnerships?
Well, the first thing I would say is to go see suppliers in person. Go to their turf, see their operations, and really educate yourself about what you're talking about. And I would be honest and say, in the example of raising pork without gestation crates, for example, I would say, I've never raised a pig. But here's what I've learned from the advocates that I work with. And again, being honest about that, I work with advocates. I had somebody try to call me out publicly once in an op-ed and say, stop pretending that you're not in partnership with the Humane Society. And I said, stop pretending. Who was pretending? It's on our website that we're in partnership with the Humane Society. I'm proud of these alignments. So always be honest. Go see people, learn, try to understand their perspective, and then very clearly sit in your own perspective. Even though I've never raised a pig, I looked at a gestation crate and said, I don't think that's humane. And I went to the #1 animal behaviorist in the country, Temple Grandin, and said, what do you think? And she said, that is not humane. Went back to the supplier. They didn't agree still, and so we changed suppliers.
Wow. One thing we find too, and I'm sure you come to this crossroads where sometimes the person's mind that you're trying to change, for example, or convince, they might agree with you, but it may not be practical, reasonable, even available, whatever it might be, realistic. Did you find a lot of that in the supply chain work that you were doing? For example, the farmer might say, you're right, it's not humane, but as of right now, there are no other ways to do this at scale. For example, I don't know if that's the case, but did you find?
Yeah, I didn't find that they would say, you're right, this isn't humane, but I would find that they actually believed it wasn't inhumane. And that's not because they hated animals. Nobody goes into animal production because they hate animals. Nobody goes into aquaculture because they want to destroy the ocean, right? But we all have different values and different ideas about those trade-offs you mentioned. What's acceptable damage is different to all of us. everything's going to be damaging at some point. You could say the most humane thing would be to not eat the pigs in the first place, right? And some people do make that choice. I'm deeming it okay to kill animals for food, but I want it to be done in a certain way. It's all a spectrum.
Yeah. But I think that what's rising to the top here is just seeing it from others' perspectives. I think that's really important. We have this question that we always throw out there, and it's this idea of a magic wand, right? If you could wave a magic wand and make it all happen overnight, relating to sustainability, leadership, getting your story heard, making change, what would things look like over the weekend? What would you change? Food system, corporate business, or otherwise?
Yeah. If I could wave a magic wand, I would wave it over animal agriculture. I think that it is problematic in many ways, both in terms of how the animals are treated, as we've been talking about, as well as the impacts of raising animals. 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the food system, and the lion's share of that comes from cows. And so I would raise a magic wand that would reinvent our animal agriculture system so we'd relied less on intensive farming, that we as a society wanted to eat fewer animals, and that we could put structures back in place like small scale slaughterhouses that allow for a different type of farmer to be economically viable. So it'd be a complicated wand, but that's where I'd wave it.
Is the food industry making strides towards that perfect utopia in your mind? What are they doing right? What do you think that the food industry is getting right in this space?
The things that make me hopeful are, if we look at like Purdue Farms as an example, they're a large scale chicken producer, but they were able to eliminate antibiotics from their farms. They also acquired Niman Ranch, and they have not diluted the Niman Ranch commitments to animal welfare and sustainability. They've instead learned a lot from Niman and brought them back to the larger company. So when I see somebody at that scale, a multi-billion-dollar business doing better, then I turn to everybody else and say, they're doing it, why can't you?
Yeah. So you're optimistic then. You feel like there's good progress being made and more to come.
The classic is you see the glass half full or half empty. I'm pretty pragmatic. I see it as exactly where it is.
That's fair. How about the future and outlook? I guess when we look forward, whether it's on this topic, or I also like to kind of try to tap people on their shoulder to say, well, what other topics do you think people need to know about in this space? When they read your book, either when they walk away or as they dive into, is there a specific topic in all of this that rises to the top for you that you want people to pay attention to?
Well, what I really want people to get from reading the book is that this is not just about doing good for goodness sake. And I wish more people just had pure altruism in their heart and wanted their companies to do good. But it's really about the marriage of doing what's right for the planet or for people and building good business on it. And I think that it's a powerful combination that I hope that more people can recognize, that sustainability isn't just about costs. It's also about leadership, market share, and driving revenues.
And I would imagine the answer to this next question might reside already in the book, but who do you look to for inspiration who are doing some of these things? Who are you learning from these days? I do think in sustainability, we're always kind of learning, trying to keep up, see what others are doing. We're learning from each other, being inspired by each other. Where do you find inspiration, your resources? Who do you get your advice from in this space?
Well, a lot of the people that I did get to talk to in the book were because I looked to them. So Gary Hirschberg from Stonyfield, Chris Arnold, who ran communications at Chipotle. There's a brand, there's a lot to be admired there. Beyond the food space, I often look to technology at how they're solving problems. One person that I quote in the book, I think the only non-food person I quote in the book, and I didn't speak to him personally, but is Scott Galloway, Prof G, who has a couple technology-related podcasts. And I'm not saying I agree with everything that he says, but he talks about how to handle things when something goes wrong. And I applied that to greenwashing, because you are going to have something go wrong on your sustainability journey. But how do you handle it. And he talks about taking responsibility and overcorrecting and apologizing. And I think that that's really key. So I look outside the food industry as well.
Yeah, that's important to do. It's important to kind of step outside of our bubble sometimes and just look around, talk to others, go to conferences, do some networking, and hear other stories. If you had to boil it all down, this is the time when we start to get down to the nuts and bolts of things here, and you had to offer 3 takeaways for the audience in terms of we want them to go read the book, so go buy the book. There's going to be a link. There's way more than just 3 things. I get that, but what 3 things do you want to leave listeners with, takeaways that you can give them?
So the first, the book is written into 5 lessons, but if I boiled the 5 into 3, it would be first to make sure that all of your systems are aligned with your sustainability commitments. And what I mean by that is, for example, are people being evaluated and bonused based on your sustainability commitments? Or are they being evaluated and bonused based simply on creating the lowest cost product? Those 2 things are probably in conflict. So have you aligned your corporate systems to encourage everyone towards sustainability and to measure whatever it is that you're promising? Number 2 would be, which is lesson 4, what to do when things go wrong. So the second thing would be about being transparent, and not just a little transparent, but what I would call radically transparent. So when things go wrong, as they did for me, and they will for you, I promise, are you the first person to tell that story? When we missed our animal welfare commitment, I put out a press release and put a blog post up on our website. Now, it turned out nobody really cared. But if they did, or if they had felt like we were hiding it, as they say, the cover-up is often worse than the crime. So the second takeaway would be transparent at a level that you're uncomfortable being transparent about. And then the third piece is about how to tell your story. It seems like telling your sustainability story would be easy because it's such a nice, feel-good story. But it turns out that there's a lot of complicated science and words people don't understand. Even in this conversation, I used the word satiety, and you didn't know what that meant. So that was poor storytelling on my part, right? So really being conscious and cognizant of your audience and what's going to capture their interest and when they are ready to listen to your story. So those would be my 3 takeaways. Align your systems, be radically transparent, and conscientiously tell your story.
Those are great, and it's always great when we can create a business case within the podcast. It's very meta, right? It's like when we proved your point. I think that's great. For people that are on their journey, whether they are kind of new in the space, they've been tasked with building out their sustainability program, or they're a few years into it, or they're getting ready to retire. What advice do you have to them? I know those are 3 different channels, so that's hard going back to speaking to our audience. But for maybe those that are getting started and are looking to just feeling overwhelmed, they don't know where to start. What advice do you have for them?
Well, for any of those 3 groups, I'd start with what's your sphere of influence? What is it that you have responsibility for? And start there versus looking beyond what you have control over. What is your department focused on? And then trying to really crystallize the values you're trying to implement. And what I mean by that is, like at Bon Appétit, we were very focused on local purchasing because for us, the value was fresh local food because it tasted good. Therefore, organic was not part of our purchasing strategy. If you look at Stonyfield, what Gary was trying to do with that company was reduce pesticide use and prove it could be done in an economically viable way. So for him, organic was the number 1 priority. And so if you're starting out, or if you're a middle manager, or you're towards the end of your career, what is your priority and what initiatives are going to get to that point the quickest?
Yeah, that's helpful. This one's a tough one because I kind of know the answer. It's hard to pin down, but when we talk about sustainability, there's so much to consider. It's this holistic approach: energy, emissions, waste, water, biodiversity, soil impacts, human impacts, supply chains. whatever it might be, if you had to kind of pluck one of those topics out and say, hey, keep an eye on this one in the future, if you were to really study up, do you have one that you would sort of elevate to the top?
Well, I think the one that's already been elevated probably for most people who are listening to this podcast is they've already are thinking about emissions.
Yeah.
So many companies have made net zero goals, 2030, 2050. I'm guessing most don't know how they're going to actually achieve those. So of course, you've got to keep an eye on that. But what my advice would be, in addition to doing that, is to really look at the human aspects. I think that doesn't get enough play. It's harder to measure. It's harder to know what the right actions are. It's not necessarily about science when you start talking about human behavior and the horrible things that we do to each other. But that's where I would say keep an eye on.
Good advice. Maisie, with all of your experience and all the work that you've done and been doing with the book, there's so many other questions I have. I feel like we could go on for another hour. I may circle back midway through the book tour to find out how things are going and see if you've got any other stories for us. But is there anything else you want to leave us with? Anything else that we didn't touch on that you want to throw out here to listeners?
I would just hope that everybody hears this as an empowering message, that you do have the power to make change, that you can do that within the constraints of your business, and that it can be good for your business. So I hope that people are ready to go out and act. That's the most important piece.
Yeah, get out there and go get some work done. That's not to you, that's to to our listeners. I'll put the link down there to the book where they can get the book, but where do you want people to go to learn more about the work you're going to continue doing as a retiree now, or about the book itself? Where do we steer them?
MaisieGanzler.com would be a great place to go.
Well, Maisie Ganzler, thank you so much for being on Inspiring Perspectives today. It was so great hearing your perspective. Thank you for sharing all that amazing advice with us, and good luck with the book launch and with all of the rest of the work you're doing in this new phase of your career.
Thanks, Derek.
Hey, thanks for checking out our show today. This show was produced by the team at Think Parallax, a sustainability and communications agency with 2 decades of experience working with companies at every stage of the sustainability journey. We are experts at assessing where a company is today, defining a North Star, and developing a roadmap to get there. If your team needs sustainability guidance or training, or you have a recommendation for a guest or a topic on the show, visit us at thinkparallax.com. We'd love to hear from you.